The night they laughed at me, I was standing in a pawn shop trying not to cry over a wedding ring I never thought I'd take off. My divorce had emptied more than my bank account. It had stripped away the life everyone assumed would last forever. By the time I sold the ring, I was 3 weeks behind on rent, dodging calls from my landlord, and calculating how many groceries I could buy with whatever money the ring brought in. What hurt most wasn't losing the marriage. It was watching people who had once called themselves family treat my struggle like entertainment. My cousins joked about my fresh start. My former in-laws whispered about how quickly I'd fallen apart. Even old friends seemed fascinated by the story of how far I'd dropped. Then, 6 months later, I walked into a charity gala held inside the most prestigious building downtown, the same building everyone in the city recognized instantly. I wasn't supposed to be the center of attention that night. At least, that's what everyone believed. But when the master of ceremonies invited the new owner to the stage, the room went silent. Faces changed. Conversations stopped. And the people who had spent months laughing at the woman who sold her wedding ring to pay rent suddenly realized they were looking at the person who had quietly purchased the entire building. 6 months earlier, my life looked nothing like the polished version everyone would eventually see at that gala. I was 41 years old, recently divorced, sharing a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a heater that only worked when it felt like it, and trying to convince myself every morning that starting over wasn't the same thing as failing. The divorce had ended quietly on paper but violently in practice. My ex-husband, Daniel, had moved on long before the marriage officially ended, and while he was building a new life, I was sorting through boxes, selling furniture, and making impossible choices about which bills could wait another week. The wedding ring was the last valuable thing I owned. I remember staring at it in my palm before handing it across the counter, thinking about all the promises attached to that small piece of gold and how little those promises were worth now. What I didn't realize was that several people who knew me would eventually hear about it. In our city, stories traveled fast, especially stories about someone falling from grace. Before long, acquaintances who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly knew intimate details about my finances. At family gatherings, conversations stopped when I entered rooms. At social events, I caught sympathetic smiles that felt more insulting than cruel. Everyone seemed convinced they were witnessing the final chapter of my story. They saw the woman selling jewelry to pay rent. They saw the divorce. They saw the small apartment. What they didn't see was what I was doing every night after work, what I was building in silence, and why I had decided that if I was going to rebuild my life, I would do it so quietly that nobody would notice until it was impossible to ignore. The rebuilding started with something most people would have dismissed as insignificant. During the final years of my marriage, I had worked as a commercial property analyst for a mid-sized investment firm. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't the kind of job that impressed people at parties, but it taught me how cities changed, how neighborhoods evolved, and how valuable opportunities often looked like problems before they looked like profits. After the divorce, I continued working during the day while spending nearly every evening researching distressed commercial properties. I wasn't looking for miracles. I was looking for patterns. The city was changing rapidly, and several large development projects had been approved near downtown. Most people were focused on luxury towers and flashy announcements, but I kept noticing smaller details buried inside planning documents and council reports. Certain blocks were becoming more valuable every month, even though the market hadn't fully reacted yet. Around that time, I met an older investor named Margaret through a networking event I almost skipped because I couldn't afford the ticket. We started talking about commercial real estate, and unlike most people, she listened when I spoke. Over several months, she became both a mentor and a friend. She didn't hand me opportunities or write me checks. What she gave me was far more valuable: perspective. She taught me how wealthy people evaluated long-term value instead of short-term appearances. While everyone around me seemed obsessed with visible success, Margaret focused on assets, leverage, patience, and timing. Meanwhile, the people in my personal life were drawing their own conclusions about my future. My cousins openly discussed my situation as if I weren't present. One of them suggested I should move in with relatives because living alone was too expensive for someone in my position. Another joked that at least selling my wedding ring had covered a few months of rent. They laughed. Others smiled politely. Nobody defended me because nobody believed I was capable of changing the narrative. Even Daniel occasionally heard stories about me through mutual friends and seemed satisfied by what he learned. As far as everyone knew, I was surviving, not succeeding. They saw a woman cutting expenses, driving an aging car, wearing the same outfits repeatedly, and declining expensive invitations. What they didn't understand was that every dollar I wasn't spending was being redirected towards something else. Quietly, patiently, and without telling anyone, I was assembling a small investment group with two partners Margaret introduced me to. We spent months studying one particular property downtown, a historic commercial building that most investors had already written off. The structure needed extensive renovations, occupancy rates were low, and ownership disputes had scared away larger buyers. On the surface, it looked like a headache. But beneath the problems was something few people recognized: location. The building sat directly in the path of several major developments scheduled to transform the area over the next 5 years. While others focused on the building's current struggles, we focused on its future value. The problem was that acquiring it would require patience, negotiations, and absolute secrecy. If competitors realized what we were doing, the price would increase immediately. So we worked quietly. Month after month, while family members discussed my failures and old friends wondered how I was getting by, I spent evenings reviewing contracts, analyzing projections, and participating in meetings nobody knew existed. There were moments when I questioned everything. More than once I looked at my bank account and wondered whether everyone else was right about me. More than once I sat alone in my apartment staring at spreadsheets while hearing echoes of conversations that suggested my best years were already behind me. But every time doubt appeared, I reminded myself of something Margaret once said: the people watching your struggle rarely notice your preparation. I didn't fully understand those words at the time. Eventually, I would. Because while everyone was busy watching the visible parts of my life, the invisible parts were beginning to change everything. The negotiations for the building stretched on for nearly 4 months, and there were several moments when it seemed the entire deal would collapse. The ownership dispute was tangled between multiple heirs, attorneys, and investors who all wanted different outcomes. Every week brought a new complication. One day a financing issue appeared. The next week an unexpected lien surfaced. Then a competing buyer emerged and briefly threatened to derail everything. Through it all, I continued living exactly the same way I had before. I went to work, returned to my apartment, cooked inexpensive meals, and ignored the assumptions people made about my life. In some strange way, their low expectations became an advantage. Nobody was paying attention. Nobody was asking difficult questions. Nobody imagined I might be involved in something significant. Around that time, Daniel's engagement to the woman he'd started seeing before our divorce became public. Social media filled with carefully staged photographs, and mutual friends seemed eager to make sure I saw them. I smiled politely whenever someone mentioned the engagement and changed the subject. What nobody knew was that I no longer felt the need to compete with appearances. The divorce had taught me how dangerous it was to confuse public image with reality. Daniel looked successful. I was becoming successful. There was a difference. Meanwhile, my cousins continued treating me like a cautionary tale. At a family birthday dinner, one of them asked whether I was still living in that tiny apartment. Another suggested I should start dating again because finding a financially stable man would make life easier. The comment earned laughter around the table. I laughed too, not because it was funny, but because explaining the truth would have ruined everything. The fewer people who knew, the better. As the months passed, our investment group moved closer to completing the acquisition. The final hurdle involved securing additional capital for renovation plans. This was where Margaret's network proved invaluable. She introduced us to experienced investors who cared more about numbers than appearances. They evaluated the opportunity objectively and recognized what many others had missed. Within weeks, commitments began arriving. For the first time since my divorce, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by recovery. Maybe I wasn't rebuilding my old life. Maybe I was creating something entirely different. Then came the day we signed the final documents. I remember sitting in a conference room surrounded by attorneys, stacks of paperwork, and cups of cold coffee. The process itself felt surprisingly ordinary considering how much it represented. After months of negotiations, analysis, and preparation, the signatures took only minutes. When the last document was completed, I looked down at the ownership structure one final time. Through our investment partnership, I had become the largest individual stakeholder in one of the most recognizable buildings in the city. Not because I inherited it. Not because someone rescued me. Not because luck suddenly appeared. Because I stayed focused while everyone else was distracted by the visible version of my life. We agreed to keep the ownership structure private while renovation plans moved forward. Public announcements would come later. That suited me perfectly. I had spent so much time being underestimated that anonymity felt comfortable. Over the next several months, renovation work began, occupancy rates improved, and property values throughout the area continued climbing exactly as projected. The building that many investors had ignored started attracting attention. Local business publications began mentioning it. Development analysts started discussing its strategic importance. Still, nobody connected the story to me. Then, one afternoon, an invitation arrived for an annual charity gala held inside the building itself. The event attracted city leaders, investors, business owners, and many of the same social circles that had watched my divorce unfold. Near the bottom of the invitation was a note informing attendees that the building's new ownership group would be recognized publicly for the first time during the event. I stared at the message for a long moment. For months I had avoided proving people wrong because proving them wrong wasn't the goal. Building something meaningful was the goal. Yet as I looked at that invitation, I realized something important. Sometimes silence is powerful. But sometimes the truth deserves an audience. And for the first time, I suspected that the people who had spent so much energy measuring my failures were about to receive information they never saw coming. The night of the gala arrived on a cool autumn evening, and as I stood in front of the mirror preparing to leave my apartment, I found myself thinking about the woman who had walked into that pawn shop 6 months earlier. She had been terrified, exhausted, and convinced that survival was the only goal left. The woman looking back at me now wasn't fearless, but she was different. She understood something she hadn't understood then: hardship had never been evidence of weakness. It had been evidence of transition. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, and drove myself downtown. The irony wasn't lost on me. The building hosting the event was now partially mine, yet I arrived without a driver, without an entourage, and without any visible signs of wealth. Old habits die slowly. When I entered the ballroom, I immediately recognized several familiar faces. My cousins were there. A few former friends were there. Daniel and his fiancée were there as guests of one of the event sponsors. The room buzzed with conversations, champagne glasses, and polished introductions. For the first hour, everything unfolded exactly as expected. People greeted me politely but with the same quiet surprise they always seemed to carry when seeing me at events. A few asked how I had been doing. Others offered carefully disguised sympathy. One cousin mentioned how strong I must be after everything that had happened, using the kind of tone people reserve for someone they believe is still struggling. Another asked whether I was enjoying my new apartment, clearly assuming my circumstances hadn't changed. I answered calmly, smiled often, and revealed nothing. Across the room, I noticed Daniel speaking confidently with investors and business executives. He looked comfortable, successful, admired. At one point our eyes met. He nodded politely before returning to his conversation. There was no anger left between us anymore. Just distance. Eventually dinner concluded and guests were invited to focus their attention toward the stage. The event organizer began recognizing donors, community leaders, and development partners who had contributed to several city improvement projects. Then the conversation shifted toward the building itself. The organizer spoke about its history, its importance to the city's future, and the investment group responsible for preserving it rather than allowing it to be demolished. Applause followed. I felt my heartbeat accelerate for the first time all evening. Even though I knew what was coming, anticipation has a way of making certainty feel uncertain. Then the organizer smiled and said something that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. Tonight, we'd also like to introduce one of the primary owners whose vision helped make this project possible. Several people turned instinctively toward a group of well-known investors seated near the front. Others glanced around the room searching for someone recognizable. Nobody looked at me. Not yet. The organizer continued speaking about resilience, long-term vision, and believing in value before others could see it. Then he said my name. For a brief second, nothing happened. It was as if the room needed time to process the information. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Expressions froze. I watched confusion spread across faces that had spent months confidently defining who I was. One cousin actually looked behind her, apparently assuming there must be another woman with the same name. Daniel's expression shifted first from surprise, then disbelief, then something more difficult to identify. I stood slowly and walked toward the stage. The silence felt almost unreal. Not because people were impressed by wealth, but because the story they had built about me no longer made sense. They had categorized me as the divorced woman who sold her wedding ring to pay rent. They had decided that chapter was the entire book. Now they were being forced to confront the possibility that they had never understood the story at all. When I reached the stage, applause finally began, hesitant at first, then stronger. The organizer handed me the microphone. Hundreds of eyes followed every movement. Many of those eyes belonged to people who had once laughed at my lowest moment. And for the first time, they were waiting to hear what I had to say. As I stood on that stage looking out at the crowd, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel angry. For months I had imagined this moment in different ways, but none of those versions matched reality. There was no desire to embarrass anyone. No urge to settle scores. No need to remind people of the things they had said when they thought my life was falling apart. The truth was far simpler. I had already won long before I stepped onto that stage. The building, the investment, the recognition, those were results. The real victory had happened on the nights nobody saw, when I kept moving forward despite the humiliation, the uncertainty, and the loneliness. I thanked the organizers for their kind words and briefly spoke about the importance of seeing value where others see problems. I talked about preserving history, investing in communities, and believing in long-term possibilities. Then I shared something more personal. I told the audience that 6 months earlier, I had sold my wedding ring because I needed money for rent. The ballroom became completely silent. Many people already knew that story. They had heard it through gossip, assumptions, and whispered conversations. But hearing it from me felt different. I smiled and continued. At the time, I thought selling that ring was the lowest point of my life. Looking back, I think it was the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to save me. The silence deepened. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody exchanged knowing looks. Nobody treated my struggle like entertainment. For the first time, they understood what that chapter had actually represented. It wasn't the story of a woman losing everything. It was the story of a woman letting go of something that no longer belonged in her future. When I finished speaking, the applause was immediate and sincere. As I stepped away from the microphone, dozens of people approached me. Some wanted to congratulate me. Others wanted to discuss business opportunities. A few simply wanted to introduce themselves. The most memorable conversations, however, came from the people who had underestimated me. One cousin awkwardly admitted she had assumed I was barely getting by. Another confessed she never imagined I was involved in a project of this scale. Their words weren't cruel anymore. They were uncomfortable. The confidence that had fueled their assumptions was gone. Later that evening, Daniel approached me while guests were gathering near the ballroom exits. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled and shook his head. "I didn't see this coming," he admitted. "Neither did most people," I replied. He laughed softly and looked around the building. "You built something impressive." It was the first completely honest compliment he had given me in years. "Thank you," I said. There wasn't much else to discuss. Our lives had moved in different directions. As he walked away, I realized I felt no bitterness. Success hadn't erased the pain of the past, but it had changed my relationship with it. Near the end of the evening, Margaret found me standing beside one of the ballroom windows overlooking the city skyline. She raised her glass and smiled. "Remember what I told you?" she asked. I nodded immediately. "The people watching your struggle rarely notice your preparation." She smiled wider. "And now?" I looked around the room. At the investors, city leaders, relatives, old friends, and former skeptics filling a building they never expected me to own. Then I looked out at the streets below, where construction projects were already reshaping the future we had seen long before anyone else. "Now I understand it," I said. Months earlier, I had walked into a pawn shop believing I was losing the last symbol of the life I wanted. What I didn't know was that life was already ending, making room for something better. The ring had paid a month's rent. The lessons that followed helped buy a building. And as I left the gala that night, passing beneath the illuminated name displayed above the entrance, I couldn't help noticing the full-circle irony of it all. The same people who laughed when I sold my wedding ring had just spent an entire evening celebrating the woman who bought the building. A few weeks after the gala, life settled into something surprisingly ordinary. The headlines faded, the excitement moved on to other stories, and the building continued operating like any other successful property. That was my favorite part. The recognition had been satisfying, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was waking up each morning knowing I had built something real. Not a reputation. Not an image. Not a carefully curated social media version of success. Something tangible that existed whether people applauded it or not. Over time, a few relatives tried harder to reconnect. Some friendships quietly returned. Others disappeared completely. I learned not to take either personally. People often treat you according to the story they've written about you, and when that story changes, so do they. But the most important change happened inside me. I stopped measuring my life through the opinions of people who only paid attention to visible results. I stopped feeling embarrassed about the difficult chapters. And I stopped viewing setbacks as evidence that I was moving backward. Sometimes the moments that look like failure are actually the moments creating your future. Selling that wedding ring felt like losing everything. In reality, it was the first step toward becoming someone stronger than I had ever been before. So if you're in a season where people are underestimating you, doubting you, or quietly counting you out, remember this: they are watching your current chapter, not your entire story. Keep building anyway. Keep preparing anyway. And one day, the same people who laughed at your struggle may find themselves standing inside something you created. If this story resonated with you, share in the comments, what is one setback in your life that eventually became a blessing in disguise? And if you enjoy stories about resilience, quiet success, and unforgettable karma, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next story.